On July 15, 2025, in the state of Florida, one man will take his final breath. No crowds, no last-minute appeals, just the sound of footsteps echoing down a cold prison hallway. After more than 3 decades of silence, the justice system is finally ready to close the book on Michael Bernard Bell, a man prosecutors say never deserved a second chance. It's been over 30 years since the city of Jacksonville was rocked by a string of violent acts, some so brutal they were buried in sealed case files for decades. Now, the man at the center of it all is facing the consequences. Michael Bernard Bell isn't just another death row inmate, he's a symbol of a justice system pushed to its limits. A man whose name was nearly forgotten until a scheduled execution thrust his story back into the spotlight. Some ask, why did it take more than 30 years? The answer is as unsettling as the crimes themselves. Bell didn't just commit atrocities, he became a ghost that haunted the edges of every legal process meant to contain him. It all began in 1989 in the quiet suburbs of Jacksonville. A young mother and her 2-year-old son never made it out of their home. The case went cold. No witnesses, no cameras, no clear motive. Just silence and 2 lives lost. But that was only the beginning. Fast forward to December 9, 1993, a typical Florida night, 3 young people sitting in a parked car outside a bar. Laughter, music, headlights in the distance, then chaos. Witnesses say the man who stepped out of the vehicle was calm, methodical. He fired a semi-automatic rifle directly into the front seat. Then he turned and opened fire at the building, at pedestrians, at anyone in his line of sight. When it was over, 2 more lives were gone and an entire city was left paralyzed with fear. Jacksonville would never be the same. The next morning, shell casings littered the parking lot. Eyewitnesses were traumatized. Police scrambled to contain the panic and find whoever was responsible. That night marked the tipping point. The event that forced detectives to connect the dots they had missed for years. Suddenly, earlier tragedies began to make sense. A single mother and her child, a man found dead in his home, no clear motive. Each case tied together by a single thread, Michael Bernard Bell. Once police had a name, the investigation snowballed. Witness statements, ballistics reports, security footage. A key break came when a woman, later identified as Bell's partner at the time, admitted she had purchased the rifle used in the shooting at his request just 1 day prior. They say justice is blind. But in this case, it had been asleep. When Bell was finally arrested in 1994, he didn't resist. He didn't confess. He didn't deny. He just waited, like he knew this moment would come. As detectives dug deeper, Bell began to talk. Cold, calculated, emotionless. He described what happened in a way that chilled even the most experienced officers. His justification. Sometimes, for justice to be served, innocent people have to fall too. That was his truth, his logic, his version of justice. In a single breath, he erased the lives of 5 people, one of them a child, and spoke of it as if he were reciting a weather report. So here we are, decades later. No more appeals. No more courtroom drama. Michael Bernard Bell is out of moves. He's scheduled to be the 8th person executed in Florida in 2025, a year already marked by an unusually high rate of death penalty rulings. The state says this is closure, but for many, the scars remain. Families of victims who waited 30 years to hear the word guilty said in a courtroom, detectives who still carry photos from those early case files. A city that never fully healed. The cell where Bell now spends his final days is just 6 by 9 feet, a metal bed, a concrete table, a steel toilet. The windows don't open, but endings don't appear out of nowhere, not without a beginning. To understand who Michael Bernard Bell became, you have to understand where he came from. Born sometime in the mid-1960s deep in the heart of Jacksonville, Florida, Bell didn't grow up like most kids. His childhood wasn't measured in birthdays or school field trips. It was measured in broken windows, screaming matches behind thin apartment walls, and nights spent wondering if tomorrow would ever be better than today. He was raised in the kind of household where love came second to survival. His father was absent. His mother struggled with her own demons. By the age of 11, Bell had already been reported for truancy. By 13, he'd been arrested for theft. And by 16, he'd learned something most kids never should: violence gets you noticed. Violence gets results. He wasn't born evil, he was born invisible. And somewhere along the way, he decided being feared was better than being forgotten. In the years that followed, Bell drifted between juvenile detention centers, halfway houses, and correctional facilities. Each place hardened him a little more. He had no job history, no higher education, no anchor to anything except resentment. Resentment toward a world that had overlooked him, toward the system that punished him but never helped him, and toward the people he blamed for everything he lost, even when he never had it to begin with. By his early 20s, Bell had already built a reputation in Jacksonville's West Side neighborhoods, not for petty theft or vandalism, but for being unpredictable, dangerous. People who knew him said he had a charisma that drew others in, only to turn cold once he had what he wanted. Some say he could manipulate almost anyone, women, friends, even authority figures. He wasn't just violent, he was strategic. He could charm you with a smile and threaten you in the same breath. And then in 1989, something changed. Michelle Washington was a single mother trying to build a better life. She had a 2-year-old son who meant the world to her. She worked hard, kept to herself. But on one night in October, all of that would disappear. Bell entered her home. What happened inside those walls remains sealed in court files and unspoken in public records. But what's known is this. Michelle and her baby were found together unresponsive. The case was marked unsolved. No suspects, no leads, just loss. To the city, it was a mystery. To Bell, it was practice. Because 4 years later, he struck again. This time, the target was close, his mother's boyfriend. No motive was ever released. No press coverage, but the pattern was emerging. Bell didn't just lash out, he escalated, and each act became more bold, more visible. Until finally, December 9, 1993, the bar, the rifle, the chaos, it wasn't random, it wasn't reckless, it was personal. Bell believed that one of the men inside a nearby car had been involved in his brother's death. He didn't care if that was true, he didn't verify, he just reacted with force. 2 innocent people gone in seconds, dozens of others traumatized, a city in lockdown, and Bell, he vanished. For months, Jacksonville police hunted through neighborhoods, questioned acquaintances, reviewed grainy surveillance footage. All the while, Bell was just out there, hiding, watching, waiting. He wasn't on the run, he was one step ahead. When he was finally arrested in September 1994, Bell didn't put up a fight. He didn't offer an explanation. In fact, what he offered was something even more chilling, his confession. But not in the courtroom, not to police. To friends, to people he trusted. As if it was just another Thursday night in Jacksonville, Florida. December 9, 1993. The temperature was mild. The streets quiet, Christmas lights blinked on front porches. Inside a small liquor store and bar on the city's north side, people were winding down, grabbing a drink, sharing stories, trying to forget their worries for a while. No one suspected that just a few blocks away, a man with a loaded rifle was driving toward them with one thought on his mind. Revenge. Michael Bernard Bell was behind the wheel. 2 men rode with him, accomplices, though history would forget their names. What mattered to Bell wasn't who sat beside him, it was who sat in the car ahead. In that car. 22-year-old Jimmy West behind the wheel. Beside him, 18-year-old Tamka Smith. A third young woman sat in the back. They weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't expecting trouble, and they had no idea who Bell was. But to Bell, that didn't matter, because in his eyes they were connected to the pain he carried, and that was all the justification he needed. Just weeks before, Bell's brother had been killed in what police believe was a targeted street conflict. Bell, convinced Jimmy was involved, decided justice wouldn't wait for a courtroom. He pulled up behind their car. He stepped out. And with the kind of precision that can only come from total detachment, he raised his weapon, an AK-style rifle, and opened fire. 12 rounds, Jimmy West never had a chance, neither did Tamka. The third passenger survived only because she was shielded by the chaos. But what happened next wasn't just targeted violence, it was full-scale devastation. Bell turned the rifle on the bar, on the sidewalk, on strangers, on the night itself. Bullets flew into walls, cars, windows. People screamed, ducked, ran for cover. His accomplice joined in, adding to the chaos. It wasn't just vengeance anymore, it was spectacle, it was domination. It was one man declaring to an entire city, "I decide who lives," and then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. Bell jumped back into the car and vanished into the night, leaving behind sirens, shattered glass, and the kind of silence that only comes after something terrible has happened. The aftermath was immediate. Police arrived within minutes. Witnesses poured out of the bar in tears, some still shaking. Shell casings littered the parking lot. 7.62 rounds, standard for an assault rifle. Officers cordoned off the area, searching for surveillance cameras, gathering statements, trying to make sense of a scene that felt like it belonged in a war zone, not a Florida neighborhood. For Jacksonville, this wasn't just a crime, it was a message. That someone out there could shatter lives in public and get away with it. And for a few days, he did. Local news ran stories about the victims. Community members held vigils. Families cried out for justice. But Bell, he disappeared. He didn't leave town. He didn't skip the state. He simply slipped back into the shadows, confident that no one could touch him. What he didn't know was that this time he left a trail. And the police were following it. The mistake wasn't in what he did, it was in how brazen he had become. Bell thought no one could stop him, but the evidence told a different story. Witnesses remembered his face. A bar security guard recognized him from earlier that week. One anonymous tip named him outright. And most damning of all, the rifle had been purchased just 24 hours before the attack by his girlfriend using her ID. When detectives questioned her, she cracked, admitted everything. Bell had the gun that night. He asked her to buy it. He planned to. The morning after the shooting, Jacksonville felt different. Not just because two young people had lost their lives in a senseless act of public violence, but because, for the first time, it was clear that whoever had done this wasn't afraid to be seen. He didn't hide in shadows. He acted in front of dozens of witnesses. He left behind bullet casings, shattered windows, and trauma that wouldn't heal anytime soon. And yet, when the dust settled, he was gone. The city went into overdrive. Patrol units canvassed every inch of the neighborhood. Detectives began knocking on doors. Crime scene technicians marked shell casings, bagged fragments, and photographed everything from tire tracks to shattered glass patterns. But something was different about this investigation. It wasn't cold. It wasn't stale. It was fresh, urgent, raw, because for the first time in years, Bell had left behind more than just silence. The AK-style rifle used in the shooting wasn't some random street weapon. It had a recent traceable purchase, made just 24 hours before the attack. Detectives followed that lead straight to a woman, Bell's girlfriend at the time. The transaction was in her name. She was visibly shaken when they found her. At first, she claimed ignorance, said it was just a gun for home protection. But when detectives showed her the ballistic reports, the photos, the timeline, her story cracked. "He told me to buy it," she whispered. "He said it was for something personal." She admitted he had the gun that night, that he left with it, that when he came home he said, "It's done." That was the break the case needed. But it didn't stop there. Multiple eyewitnesses began coming forward. One of them, a security guard at the bar, recognized Bell's face from earlier that week. Another witness, a friend of Bell, told investigators that Bell had made disturbing comments just hours after the shooting. "Sometimes for justice to happen, innocent people have to fall too," Bell reportedly said. Those weren't the words of someone in hiding. Those were the words of someone convinced he had done the right thing. The challenge wasn't just proving what happened. It was proving that Bell had planned it, that he meant every second of it. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses. While no cameras caught the shooting itself, several angles showed a vehicle matching the description fleeing the scene. The make, the model, the route, it all lined up. From there, it was just a matter of time. Police pulled Bell's records and were stunned by what they found. A long, scattered history of aggression, weapons charges, juvenile offenses, and unresolved connections to other violent incidents, including the unsolved death of Michelle Washington and her 2-year-old son years earlier. But before they could even reopen those old files, they had to find him. For months, Bell moved between cheap motels, couch-surfed with acquaintances, and stayed off the grid. He didn't leave the state, but he vanished from public view. It wasn't until September 1994, 9 months after the shooting, that detectives finally tracked him to a residence on the outskirts of Jacksonville. They surrounded the property expecting resistance, but Bell didn't fight. He didn't speak. He walked out the front door, hands raised, expression blank, as if he'd been waiting for them all along. That was the most unnerving part, one detective later recalled. He didn't look scared. He didn't look angry, he just looked ready. Once in custody, Bell wasn't eager to talk to police. But he didn't stay quiet for long. He confessed, but not to them, to friends, to jailhouse contacts. To people who didn't ask, but who listened anyway, and what he said shocked even seasoned prosecutors. "I've taken care of what needed to be done, now we'll see what justice looks like." With the girlfriend's testimony, multiple eyewitness IDs, ballistics linking the weapon to the scene, and Bell's own post-crime admissions, the prosecution knew they had something solid. But then came the curveball. Bell's legal team floated a defense no one expected, that he wasn't in his right mind, that he was emotionally unstable, that the grief of losing his brother. As the court prepared for what would become one of Jacksonville's most closely watched murder trials, A deeper truth was beginning to take shape, one that stretched far beyond the December 1993 shooting. Because while prosecutors built their case around the liquor store massacre, investigators were digging into Bell's past. And what they found changed everything. Long before Bell became known as the man behind a public act of terror, he had already left behind a trail of forgotten tragedies, scattered across sealed case files, faded autopsy reports, and grieving families who never got answers. The first, October 1989. Michelle Washington, a single mother in her early 20s. Kind, hardworking, doing her best to raise her 2-year-old son in a modest home on Jacksonville's west side. She was found dead in her home alongside her child. No signs of forced entry, no suspects, no motive, no media coverage. The case was closed almost as quickly as it had been opened, filed away under unsolved. But when Bell was arrested in 1994, he didn't just talk about the recent shooting. He started talking about Michelle, and what he said sent shockwaves through the prosecution's team. "That was me," he reportedly said. "I did that, no one else." Just like that, 2 more lives were added to the count. Then came the next revelation, a man killed in the early 90s, Bell's mother's boyfriend. The details were murky. The case hadn't been tied to any larger pattern, but now, under the weight of Bell's own confessions, it was clear. This wasn't an isolated outburst in 1993. This had been building for years. He wasn't a man who snapped, one prosecutor would later say. He was a man who escalated. And his actions, each one more brazen than the last, had gone unchecked for far too long. Court records began to reveal just how methodical Bell had been, the girlfriend who bought the weapon, the rifle purchased a day before the attack, his statement that justice sometimes requires sacrifice. All of it pointed to one thing. Intent. This wasn't grief, it wasn't rage, it was purpose. Bell believed he had the right to decide who should pay for what happened in his life, the lead investigator said, and that belief became his justification for everything he did. But the most haunting aspect of the trial wasn't the facts. It was the absence of emotion. Bell didn't cry, he didn't apologize, he didn't even blink when victims' families gave their statements in court. He listened, quiet, cold, indifferent. As the prosecution laid out the timeline of his actions, Michelle, her child, the boyfriend, Jimmy, Tamka, the jury began to see what had taken so long to come together. A pattern of violence that had gone unnoticed for too long, and it wasn't random. Every single act had a target, every target served a purpose. Every purpose fit a narrative only Bell believed. "If I didn't do it, no one would," he once told a friend. "I don't hesitate." That line was repeated in court, and it changed everything. Whatever doubt the jury may have had, whatever room there was to argue diminished responsibility, disappeared. This wasn't about mental illness. This wasn't a man broken by trauma. This was someone who had built an identity out of vengeance. By the end of the trial, 5 people had been directly tied to Bell's actions. But for prosecutors, that number was only part of the story, because behind every victim was a family. Behind every family, a community. And behind all of them, a question that no one could quite answer. How did we miss this for so long? Bell wasn't just a killer, he was a mirror. A reflection of a system that didn't connect the dots until it was too late. And now, finally, the system was. The courtroom was full, not with reporters, not with cameras, but with faces. Faces of mothers, siblings, survivors, and strangers who came not just for justice but for closure. They had waited years, some decades. And now they wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had taken so much from them. Michael Bernard Bell entered the courtroom in silence. Shackled, expressionless, unchanged. He looked like he'd just come in from the grocery store, one juror later said. No fear, no remorse. Like this was all just another stop on his way to nowhere. The prosecution opened with clarity and force. They didn't dramatize, they didn't embellish. They didn't have to, they laid out the facts. The rifle purchased less than 24 hours before the attack. The eyewitness accounts placing Bell at the scene. The girlfriend's testimony linking him directly to the weapon. The chilling confessions made after the fact. But above all, the pattern. The double homicide of Michelle and her son in 1989, the murder of his mother's boyfriend. The calculated ambush outside the bar in 1993. We're not just talking about one act, the prosecutor said. We're talking about a man who built his life on destruction and left a trail of it for over a decade. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Bell had acted out of deep emotional trauma, rooted in the death of his brother. that the 1993 shooting was a moment of grief-driven confusion, not premeditated vengeance. That Bell sincerely believed he was targeting the person responsible, but their argument was fragile, and the facts unforgiving. The victims in the 1993 shooting had no connection to Bell's brother. The weapon wasn't stolen, it was purchased by someone close to him. Bell's own words, "Sometimes innocent people have to fall too," destroyed any claim of mistaken identity or mental break. "This wasn't impulse," one juror said. "This was intention, every single step." Outside the courthouse, the public watched closely. Jacksonville hadn't forgotten, not Michelle, not Tamka, not Jimmy. Not the children who watched the 1993 shooting unfold in real time. Local newspapers ran daily coverage. Talk radio lit up with debates over justice, trauma, and the death penalty. Victims' families gave quiet interviews, asking not for vengeance but for peace. "I don't want him to suffer," Michelle Washington's cousin said. "I just want to know he can't hurt anyone else ever again." And finally, after days of testimony, cross-examination, and closing arguments, the jury deliberated. It didn't take long. Bell was found guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation and malice. The sentence, death. "This court finds," the judge read, "that the defendant's actions show a total disregard for human life and a pattern of violence that leaves no room for rehabilitation." The courtroom was still, some cried, some exhaled. Bell didn't flinch. There were no last words, no apology, no emotion, just a man staring straight ahead into a future that had finally run out of roads. But the story didn't end with a gavel strike. In the years that followed, Bell filed appeals, claimed the investigation was flawed, that witnesses were pressured, that his words had been twisted. Each time the courts reviewed his case. Each time the decision stood. Florida's Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Federal courts reviewed it again. No violations, no new evidence, no chance of reversal. "The system gave him every opportunity to prove otherwise," one appellate judge wrote. "He gave us nothing." And so in 2025, over 3 decades after his first known act of violence, the execution was scheduled. For many, it was the final chapter. But for others, it was simply a pause. Because justice. Even as the execution date neared, there was a strange quiet surrounding Michael Bernard Bell. No final interviews, no public statement of remorse, no handwritten letters to the families he had shattered, not a word. It was as if he had said everything he needed to say in blood and saw no reason to add anything else. Inside Florida State Prison, Bell remained behind thick concrete walls, locked in a small, windowless cell for over 30 years. A steel bed, a toilet, a clock he couldn't see but could still hear ticking. Outside those walls, life went on. Michelle Washington's relatives raised her son's name at candlelight vigils. Tamka Smith's younger sister went on to become a teacher, she says, to make sure someone else gets the chance her sister never did. Jimmy West's mother stopped talking to the press. She didn't need to relive it. She lived with it every day. And yet in every one of those lives, a single name still echoed, a name they didn't want to remember but couldn't forget. Michael Bernard Bell. Because how do you forget a man who turned tragedy into a mission? Bell didn't see himself as a criminal, one psychologist later wrote. He saw himself as an enforcer, a necessary force in a world he believed was broken. To Bell, justice wasn't something that came from a court. It was something you took with your own hands, something you forced the world to feel no matter the cost. But what if he believed he was right? That's what still haunts the people who survived him. Because if Bell truly believed that every person he hurt was just part of the plan, then what he left behind wasn't just grief, it was ideology. A belief that vengeance equals justice. That suffering can be balanced with more suffering. That if the world hurt you, you have a right to hurt it back. And in that belief, he became more than a man. He became a warning of what happens when anger isn't healed. When trauma is ignored. When someone falls through every safety net and chooses instead to build their identity around rage. His execution may bring closure to some, but to others it brings only questions. Questions that don't end with a lethal injection. What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Michelle had been believed? What if those earlier crimes had been solved in time? What if justice didn't take 30 years to show up? Because that's the part of the story that doesn't fit into a sentence, that no court can resolve. Not all wounds are physical, not all damage makes the news. But when a man like Michael Bernard Bell slips through the cracks again and again, it forces all of us to ask, was this the system working or the system catching up? And as the sun rises over Florida State Prison on July 15, 2025, A needle is prepared, the room is readied. The state prepares to carry out its sentence. The man who once said, "If I didn't do it, no one would," will finally be silenced, but his legacy, that's something we'll all have to carry a little longer, because justice may end with a verdict. But trauma doesn't end with a sentence. Well, if this story moved you, share it.